Hi everyone, welcome. People are starting to log on, getting close to 12 o'clock. Calling this one Rabbi Matthew's BYOL, bring your own lunch and learn. I was going to maybe do it from my home, but I didn't want to, I've been having spotty internet, so I didn't want to risk it. So I'm here in the chapel, which is great. And it's great to have a few of you logged on already. Carlos and Anna and Fabiana and Jeannie and Deb and Lou. And is that Jezeline? So yes, get on the chat if you can. Let us know. Best way to interact is through the chat if you've got questions or ideas. Hopefully today will go well. We weren't really sure how long to do this for. Usually when we've done the last couple of years, we've done lunch and learns, people will they'll kind of eat a little bit, and then we do like maybe a half-hour presentation. So we'll see how things are going. So we'll see. We'll aim for maybe half an hour, and we'll go. We'll see. Just want to let you know, someone on the chat, just let me know you can hear me okay. Please let me know if you can hear me okay. You can see me okay. I was thinking that I could stand a little bit closer, because I know the one advantage, if I had been able to do it at home, and maybe the next time I do this I will, you get a closer look, which I know is better. But I can't go that much farther this way because then I'm kind of out of the shot. So, so just let me know that you can hear me, you can see me okay, that things are working. We'll get started right away. People are coming in. Judy, and hi Claire, and Marvin, and Sandy, and Sharon. Nice. Rabbi Moss and I have a little bet. Who's going to have more people at their lunch and learn? So help me out. Pauline, Valerie. Yeah, so just please, everyone keeps saying hi. Please, could just one or couple people just type in that you can hear me okay and that you can see me okay before we get started. The judge has weighed in. Well, I'm prepared for it, Judge. I'm okay with it. Yep. So just keep getting in here. Yeah. It's great to have all of you. Bill and Alice, nice. So yeah. So no one's typing that you can hear me okay. I'm assuming you can hear me okay. If one person could just type in, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. Great. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Rabbi Louis Burkle Chapel at Congregation Shared Zedek, the building at 561 Wellington Crescent. A building that is, it's odd these days, of course. There are so few people here, and we're used to this being a Beit Knesset, a house of assembly, where people, the number one purpose is for people to get together. So it's been odd for a few weeks, as I know it has been odd for all of you. But we've still managed to master this power of assembly. In fact, in better ways than we used to be able to, where, if people were living in different cities. Now you can kind of all log on, and so we're still assembling, as I can see by the chat. This is good. And it's also weird because we're here. The ritual people take turns being here, and then we're here on Shabbat and on the Chagim. Bonnie Robinson, Bill Wiseman, Rabbi Anibal Mas, myself. And it smells, because the guys are in here every time we leave, spraying everything down, it smells like disinfectant a little bit. It smells like disinfectant. It's like the overwhelming aroma is not anything related to food, which we're going to be talking about today, but it is the borderline overwhelming aroma of disinfectant, which I guess these days is the smell of calm and relief from anxiety. But it's a little bit strange. We're talking about food in a second. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Jen and Terry and Cindy and Belle, Harry, Merrill. This is nice. This is great. Okay, welcome everybody. I titled this one Jewish Food for Thought, because let's be honest, like most Jewish people, I am fascinated by Jewish food. Not just eating, and when we kind of conceived this, we were going to be eating, so it felt like eating and then talking about food would be okay. It's dangerous to talk about food. It's dangerous to go grocery shopping when you're hungry, and it's dangerous to talk about food around lunchtime if you don't have any food in front of you. I don't have any food, so part of what could determine when we wrap this up is when I just can't take it anymore and I have to go eat some of the things we've been talking about. But I've always been fascinated by Jewish food. I'll throw a question out to you to think about right now. I want you to think about your answer. You can start typing things in. This will be informing a lot of where we go from here. What is Jewish food? What is Jewish food? Hi, Rena. Because maybe we need to back up. Is there such a thing as Jewish food? Food, we know, is a big part of Jewish life. I know that for a lot of my friends, people of my generation, younger generations, I know that it is maybe the aspect of Judaism more than religion, more than holidays, more than prayer, maybe even more than social action. Maybe food is the one thing that I think in my generation and other generations too, it connects to the past. People really, a lot of Jewish people will say, what do you love about being Jewish? How long would it take a lot of people to answer the food? The food is a huge part. The communal style of eating, the fact that Shabbat once a week is met with a huge meal, and even back in shtetl times, you go back a couple of hundred years when they would really eat very meagerly during the week. Shabbat, Friday night, was a big meal. There was a nice big lunch after shul on Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, early afternoon. Food has always been about coming together, been about celebrating, about people being together, and I really do believe that Jewish food is a huge part of Jewish people's identity, at least the Jewish people I grew up with. And remember, for those of you who don't know me or know my story, I know most of you do, born and raised in Winnipeg, went through the Jewish school system here, grade 1 to grade 12, lived in Halifax for a while, journalism school, connected with a lot of Jewish people who were students at the time in Halifax, Dalhousie, a lot of universities, a lot of Jewish kids from Toronto, Montreal, some in the East Coast, not so many from the prairies or for the West Coast, but met people in Halifax, came back to Winnipeg, and I've been living here. I've traveled a lot around the world. Lucky to be able to say that I've done that with mostly with my wife, with Heather, who I think may be watching, so hi to Heather. And so I've always been fascinated with Jewish food. So that's the first thing I want to throw out to you. Is there such a thing as Jewish food? What is Jewish food? Oh, we're getting some answers here. Nice. So, to the question, what is Jewish food? I think one of the ways we can talk about it is if when I asked you this question, maybe some of you started listing off the types of things that are Jewish food. You know, right now we're in Pesach, so we know that obviously matzah is Jewish food, matzah balls, charoset, matzah ball soup, charoset, maror, these sorts of things. How many of you had brisket? How many of you had brisket? Brisket is a very Jewish food, right? Non-Jewish people eat Jewish foods. There's probably some non-Jewish people with us too, I hope. And I don't want to say anything offensive. And certainly there are foods that are Jewish foods that haven't been invented, like it's pastrami, lox and bagels, kugel, knishes, kreplach, tzimmis. These are all Jewish foods, right? So there's got to be Jewish food. But is it enough to say Jewish foods are just the foods that Jewish people eat? And is that even necessarily true? I think we have to be careful in this conversation that we acknowledge that Jews who grew up in Morocco, for example, or in Yemen, they probably would not have listed any of the Jewish foods that I just listed, unless they've been living in North America and they've kind of learned about it. But if they've been living in Yemen, and there's generations of Jewish families living in Yemen, they're probably not, talking about all the lox and bagels they've been eating and the tuna salad and the brisket. It's different, right? The Jewish foods that we often talk about are kind of American, not just North American, but America kind of drives everything. American Jewish foods, and a lot of those foods come from where the Jews came from, which was Eastern Europe. So when we talk about this, and I'm guilty of this, so just want to get it out there, it's kind of a disclaimer, a lot of the conversation when we're talking about the Jewish food was what is Jewish food, Jewish foods, it's Ashkenazi Jewish foods, Eastern European Jewish foods. The foods that have been around in my families and a lot of your families, though I know not all of your families. So if you have a story that is not that kind of classic, stereotypical North American Jewish experience, Eastern European families, either from kind of France, Germany, or Eastern Europe, though eventually everyone was pretty much Eastern Europe, coming over, Canada, the United States, maybe even South America, a lot of Argentinian Jews, same sort of path. I think we will have a lot in common, but we can't discount the fact that Jews, they've been everywhere. We've gone everywhere. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Morocco, other places in northern Africa, Egypt, Algeria. We talked about Yemen. And the foods, because the vegetables that are available, the kinds of foods that are available, the climate, everything changes. So Jewish food, I think we need to be careful. We need to be careful. So we got great answers coming in. I love this. I love the chat. Food is our bond. Harry is saying food is our bond. We were kind of talking about that too, right? Food bringing everybody together. Food equaling survival, both physical and spiritual. And yes, that's true. Terry was saying most Jewish food is regional, eaten by the inhabitants of the countries they lived in. The foods you're listing are traditional foods, not necessarily Jewish foods. Perhaps culturally familiar and traditional. Ruth says. Okay, great. I like all these thoughts. So let's go to this next place here. So we're talking about, I wanted you to think about, is there such a thing as Jewish food? What is Jewish food? And kind of, Ruth, you were touching on it a little bit there, but also some of the other comments, maybe Terry. Jewish food is food of the world, right? I think we can establish that from what we've been saying. Because Jews have lived all over, Jewish food is adaptation. That's a good word for it. Jewish food is adaptation. That Jews were forced to move over centuries, over long periods of time. And whenever they were in a new place, of course they were influenced by the culture of that new place. But there is something very special about Jewish food. I think our conversation has to start with the Jewish food in this way. That Jews couldn't fully embrace all these new foods they were trying. All these new foods they were being exposed to from the non-Jewish world around them. And why is that? Because of kashrut. Because Judaism, among its many laws, among its many mitzvot commandments, there are specific commandments that govern food. And they're very limiting compared to what the rest of the world eats, if you get what I'm saying. They're very specific, they're very hard and fast rules, right? So just a quick refresher. And you can look up the basis for most of the kashrut, most of the dietary laws that we get come from the Torah, from Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 11. We learn things like what makes a kosher land animal. It's got to have split hooves and chew its cud. That means no pigs. Big one, right? Pigs don't chew their cud, I don't think. Their hooves are split, but they don't chew their cud. So it's got to have split hooves and it's got to chew its cud. We learn about fish, animals from the sea, that they got to have fins and scales. So shellfish, everything out. Mollusks like clams, oysters, lobster, shrimp, prawns, gone. We have a long list in Leviticus of all the birds that we can't eat. We don't have rules for birds, it's just a list of all the birds that we can't eat, all the flying animals, because bat, which I know is on a lot of people's mind these days, bat is listed among the birds or the flying animals. But it's mostly predatory birds, right? So domesticated birds like turkey and chicken, they're good. But no eagles and no hawks and no storks and no pelicans and no bats and no ostrich. I know sometimes people, their ostrich burger is a thing. No ostrich. So that's what we got with birds. And then no creepy crawlies, no mice, no lizards, no cats, no dogs. No, when it comes to insects, I mean, it gets a little bit tricky because it's really but then there's some grasshoppers that you can tell, but no one really knows. There used to be Jewish people living in Yemen who knew which grasshoppers were okay and which ones were not. And then if I'm not mistaken, at some point they were just like, no grasshoppers, which I'm okay with. I'm okay with no grasshoppers. So that's where we get the bulk of the rules. There are also a couple of other rules sprinkled in other places in the Torah, big ones you may be familiar with. No blood. You got to drain all the blood. This is after the flood with Noah. They were all vegetarians before the flood. My joke is, that's why God had to get rid of all of them. No, not so funny. Sorry to all you vegetarians, it's just a joke. After the flood, God says, Noah, fine, you can eat animals, but no blood in it. You got to drain all the blood. So that's why koshering, salt is a huge deal. You got to drain out all the blood. You use the salt to get all the blood out. You got to cook it, right? All the certain, so you can't, medium rare steaks, even if it's a kosher animal, right? Then there's other places like certain cuts of the animal, right? There's an episode where Jacob wrestles with an angel, and the angel kind of injures his sciatic nerve. So in a lot of parts of the world, there's a huge part of the cow that you can't eat at all because the sciatic nerve runs through there. In Israel, they're not going to waste, so they have special techniques where they remove that nerve, but that's another one of the rules. And then, of course, there's a rule about you can't just find an animal that died on the side of the road, even if it's a kosher animal. It's got to be killed in a proper way. Theoretically, the quickest, most painless way to kill an animal. I'm sure there's a lot of debate among people who don't eat meat especially, just how effective and how true that is. But, right, the shochering, being a kosher butcher, is, or a kosher slaughtering process is required. And then the last thing, of course, and the big one, probably, I've kind of saved it to the end, no milk and meat. The interpretation of a line, lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo. Do not boil a goat in its mother's milk. The rabbis teach us that the interpretation of this is not to combine milk and meat, and this extends, just to be safe, to poultry. So even though chickens and turkeys don't have milk, we kind of extend the rule just in case, just to kind of put a fence around the rule is the way we describe it, right? No milk and meat. So this is a quick rundown of the Jewish dietary laws. So it's very important when we talk about some of the signature foods that I've been researching and I want to share with you. The kashrut, the dietary laws, allowed Jews, wherever they were living, to both absorb and adapt the culture, the food around them, but also only to a point, right? Also only to a point. So especially when what you were cooking in, we have to remember that people haven't always cooked with butter. Before they cooked with butter or before they cooked with oil, sometimes they would cook with schmaltz, with fat. Well, the original schmaltz was goose fat. Well, you can't cook anything in goose fat that's going to be part of a dairy meal if you're Jewish. No one else, all their non-Jewish neighbors wouldn't have had that problem. But the Jews, it's important, right? So in an interesting way, I think we could say that observing kashrut kind of was a block to assimilation, to complete assimilation. It kept the Jews Jewish because their food always had this different set of rules. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And another thing for Jewish food, and get my notes up here so I can see them a little bit better. We have to remember that we talked about holidays, we talked about Shabbat, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, we talked about a link to the past. The other thing about Jewish food, I think, is that the expression, the way to someone's heart is through their stomach. And I think that's because, especially in like the Jewish world, how many times do you think of, quite often, right, nowadays things have changed, but for a long time it was the mothers and the grandmothers who were doing the food preparation and doing the feeding. And how often was their way of expressing love the way that they fed you? Eat, eat, eat. Your skin and bones, eat. They didn't have to hug you or kiss you or tell you they loved you, they fed you. I think that's an important point too, is that food in Jewish culture has always been associated with past generations, but also expressions of love and a constant. That the world is always changing, but the food is the same. And think about it, when a recipe you're familiar with is off a little bit, it doesn't sit well, does it? Right? There's something about looking forward to every whether it's every Shabbat and a certain meal, or certainly with holidays every year, the matzo ball soup is going to taste a certain way. This is going to taste a certain way. That's going to taste a certain way. It keeps us calm. It keeps our anxiety level down. We can kind of embrace and hold on to Jewish food because it is a constant. We also talked about the whole communal idea of coming together. So a little bit of an introduction. Is there such a thing as Jewish food? Sure. What is Jewish food? Well, it depends on where you live, right? Because as we'll talk about with some of these foods, depending on where you come from, you may make your kugel like this, or you make your kugel like that. You make your tzimmus with meat, you make your tzimmus without meat. So even within foods that are kind of Jewish, or are Jewish, there's variety. So Jewish food is adaptation, it's variety, it's love, it's community, it's celebration. It's a lot of things, but I think it is also a constant, and it is a bond, like some people have been saying on the chat. Let's see how the chat's doing. Looking good. All right. Awesome. Okay. So I wanted to bring with you a few stories of some foods that have always fascinated me. Obviously, there's so many different kinds of foods that we could talk about, so we won't have time to talk about all of them. So I've pulled a few stories about some food that I find particularly interesting, and I hope you do too. And I wanted to we'll start with something for Pesach, and we'll kind of end with something for Pesach to bring it in. This year in my house, first story is, so I've never actually been privy to the making of charoset. Why? Because every year it's one of the things that my Baba, my beloved Baba, 91 years old, makes. She brings the charoset. I don't even really think I can remember my mom making charoset. I'm not sure my mom really ever has. Maybe she has, but it was not a thing, right? Charoset always came from Babas. And because we were always together, right, different places you didn't need to make charoset. So Baba took care of the charoset. Well, this year, social distancing, physical distancing, isolation, we were in separate places. So if we were going to have charoset, we had to make our own charoset. And my Baba wasn't going to go to the trouble without us all being there, right? So that's fine. So Heather, my wife, tried making charoset, and she did a fabulous job. We used Baba's recipe. So I've been thinking about charoset, right? And with the Pesach foods, I think charoset deserves some mention, right? It's pretty special. Charoset, it's a fascinating story. So first of all, I can tell you that you're not going to find too many foods that we still eat today that have been around as long as charoset. Charoset was widespread by the time the Mishnah was being compiled, which is the year 200 in the Common Era. So we're talking about charoset being around, it's pushing 2,000 years. And it's like a lot of things that are that old, not many things are, but a lot of things that are that old, Greco-Roman influence, right? Now remember, when it comes to the Pesach Seder, what are we trying to recreate? This feeling of being free. That's why we're always leaning. Drink your wine leaning on the left side, eat your matzah leaning on the left side. Because in that time, 2,000 years ago, Greco-Roman, if you had a lot of money, if you were free, if you were well off, you could slouch, you could lean, you could sit on cushions, right? So what else did they have, and where did the charoset kind of get inspired? Roman elite always had dressings or condiments that they would dip their greens in. And then the Roman symposium, there are always fruit relishes, I've learned. So charoset is inspired from these sorts of ideas. Now the Talmud offers three guidelines, three kind of opinions on charoset. The first is that it should remind us exclusively of tapuchim. We'll get to that in a second. I don't want to give you an English word for it, but tapuchim. You'll see why. The second, and this is the one that most people know, is that it should remind us, and this is where charoset comes from, cheres, Hebrew word that means clay, or mud. It should remind us of clay, mud, mortar, bricks. It should be a symbol of slavery and oppression. That was what they always told us in Hebrew school, right? Why do we eat charoset? Why is it on the Seder plate? Oh, because it is like the mortar that the Jews used to make, the Israelites used to make the bricks and to build the pyramids, right? And then the third opinion in the Talmud is that it should be a combination of both. That it should be acrid or acidic, like the tapuchim, and it should be thick like the cheres, like the clay. A little bit of both. So I mentioned this tapuchim thing. Now, growing up, and if you know a little Hebrew, we translate tapuchim or tapuach as apple. Tapuchim are apples. But hang on a second. The reference in the Talmud is actually to a line. This one I never learned. Maybe I read it, but I never learned it. I learned it for this year's Pesach. That there's a line in Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. Now, you know, Song of Songs is one of the 5 Megillot, one of the scrolls, one of the 5 scrolls. Megillat Esther, which we read on Purim. Megillat Echa, Lamentations, we read on Tisha B'Av. Ruth, the book of Ruth. Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. Shir HaShirim. These are the 5 Megillot. Each one is assigned to a different holiday. So we read Ruth on Shavuot, we read Kohelet on Sukkot, and we're supposed to read Shir HaShirim or selections from it on the Shabbat in Pesach. There's a place in Shir HaShirim that talks about giving birth in the Tapuchim orchards. And a midrash, an explanation, a comment on this verse, says that in the time in Egypt when there was that rule that the midwives, right, that all the Israelite boys had to be killed, that there were mothers, Jewish Israelite mothers, giving birth in secrecy in orchards, in tapuchim orchards. And that is the reason why we have charoset. Not the mud, not the clay, not the cheres, but to remind us of the tapuchim. And in the Talmud it says, therefore, there should be an acidic quality, not overpowering, just slight, enough to remind us or to make reference to the tapuchim. It doesn't say we actually need to use tapuchim in the charoset, but there needs to be a connection to remind us of the tapuchim. Bet you haven't heard that one before. Maybe you have. Good on you if you have. I hadn't, or at least I'd forgotten it. So you got the mortar on the one hand, but you've also got this reminding us of tapuchim orchards where secret births used to happen. The only problem is, with stuff so old, what are tapuchim? I told you today we say apples. It comes from a Hebrew root, nun pe chet, nafach, which means to exude or exhale, the implication being a sweet fragrance. Okay, so it's some kind of fruit with a sweet fragrance, but we also know that it's acidic. Well, anyone who's taken a bite of an apple and left it on the counter and then gone back to it a few minutes later and it sees it's turning brown knows that apples may have a pretty good smell, but they are anything but acidic. So they weren't talking about apples. What were they talking about? Well, there's another reference in other places because tapuchim are not in the Torah. They come later in other parts of the Bible. There's a mention of a golden quality. So some interpretations are maybe a citrus, maybe an orange, maybe an etrog. But the one that seems to kind of feel good is the quince. A quince. Now, I've never had a quince myself. Somebody let me know if you've had a quince. Quince? Maybe you've had a quince? So there's some thinking that the tapuchim mentioned as the tapuchim orchards that we're trying to remember through our charoset were quinces, which had kind of a golden hue and were acidic, but also very fragrant. And there are even some communities where they have quinces. I don't think you're going to find too many quinces in North America or in Eastern Europe, but if you're in a more Mediterranean climate and they grow there, where they would actually chop up quinces and throw them into the charoset. Lisa says she has had a quince. Good for you, Lisa. That's awesome. So, again, you don't need to have tapuchim, quince, or whatever it is, but just enough of an acid component to remember it. Some people say that a little bit of wine is enough to give it that tart flavor, which again is just kind of minor in charoset. The major flavor in charoset should be something sweet. And remember, one of the practical purposes of charoset is you're supposed to dip your maror in your charoset when you do the blessing on the maror, right? Motzi matzah maror korech. After you do the 2 blessings over the matzah and you eat the matzah and you feel it go down your throat and just awful. Then you get to the maror, and the maror is supposed to be really bitter, so you dip the maror in the charoset, right? 2 dips. Karpas in the salt water, and then the maror in the charoset. And some people actually, Maimonides, Rambam, in his writing says he advocated dipping the karpas in the charoset. Charosset was a big thing, and going back to the Greco-Roman idea of 2,000 years ago that the elite had dressings and condiments to dip their veggies in. Very cool. So that's where this is coming from. And then, of course, the rabbis put all this great interpretation, all of these other significant reasons behind it. So some places, like in Song of Songs, where that quote comes from, there's other references to other fruits, the fruits that we know of the kind of the Mediterranean, the area, dates, figs, pomegranates, and nuts. The nuts they're talking about are almonds and walnuts, and that those could be and should be used to make your charosset. In some Sephardic communities, dates are the main base, where they're either boiled into a honey or crushed. And by the way, date honey, that's the honey alluded to in calling Israel land of milk and honey. They weren't talking about bees making honey. They were talking about dates boiled into honey. The first recipe, get this, the first recipe anywhere for a charosset is in a sidur that belonged to Sadia Gaon, who was born in 882. 882 to 942 is when he lived. He was in Babylonia. And his recipe, first recipe for charosses, moist sauce, make a moist sauce from dates, walnuts, sesame, and knead them in red wine vinegar. Dates, walnuts, sesame, red wine vinegar. You'll notice there's no fruit mentioned whatsoever. The typical Ashkenazi recipe today, and this is an interesting thing because charosset is one of those things that's pretty constant for most people. Apples, honey, wine, cinnamon, and then either your walnuts or your almonds. And it's used to dip the maror in, and of course, next step you make a sandwich, like Hillel did, the korech, with bitter herbs and with charosset between the matzah, and you eat it. So charosset, a little bit there. I hope you learned a little bit of something about. I hope you learned a little something about charosset. It's good. Quince, popular in South America, I'm learning. Quince. Okay, well, Carlos, save me one next time you come back. We use it in Argentina to make pie. Good. Good. In France, very nice. Okay, and hi to Debbie. So nice to have everybody here. Debbie and Belle. Alan, welcome, Alan. So a little bit about charosset. So I wanted to share that with you. I'd never really known that about Song of Songs and the Tapuchim. So but before we finish, I'll give you another Pesach story. In my family, there's always a little bit of a debate about what should be the maror. My mom, growing up, always used romaine. I always wanted red horseradish because I would see adults eat it and like their faces would light up and, well, adults can do it. I should be able to do it. And I was always kind of held back. So I've always wanted maror to be horseradish. But before the end of today's session, is that kosher? I'm not talking about kosher, like is it allowed? What should the maror be? I'll have that answer for you. The other charosset was my sister was involved. I hope she doesn't mind me telling the story. My charosset story. My sister was involved with, still is in many ways, with Winnipeg Jewish Theater. And they were doing this promotion where they had this candle, like one of those scented candles, and they were trying to name it, and they came up with the idea to make it charosset flavored. And we were struggling mightily to come up with like a fun, punny kind of name for the charosset. And in my family, my Baba, who is a big influence when it comes to all of the foods, she was a Yiddish teacher at the Parrot Shul. And so she always has a little bit of a Yiddish pronunciation. So she's never made charosset in her life, but she sure as heck made a few batches of charosses. And just to give you, I know you're not supposed to explain a joke, but this is how I got there. Again, charosset, if you want to give me your best charosset pun that you would have used for a candle, I'd love to hear it for a scented candle. What I came up with was charosses sounded like cirrhosis, which is a serious thing, and it affects your liver. But charosses, there's a lot of lovers of charosses. So I was thinking we could call it charosses of the lover, or charosses lover, or... It didn't win. It did not get chosen. I know, shocking. So, let's keep going. I mentioned for a while, I lived in Halifax. Now, this was a really interesting experience, because, you're talking about Jewish foods, and this idea that Jewish food's one of these things that can unify us. And I think if you were in a foreign place and you sat down at a table and you smelled familiar smells that reminded you of home, or you tasted things that reminded you of home, it could be a very, very soothing, comforting, and special feeling to be on the other side of the world or in a different place, but still have that constant we talked about Jewish food. So when I got to Halifax, got involved with the synagogues in Halifax. I was in my early 20s, 22, 23, 24, 25. That was when I lived in Halifax, 23, 24, 25. And I worked at the shul, and on Saturdays, a lot of times I get invited out for lunch. And in Halifax, my eyes were open to something that, for all of my Jewish upbringing, again, 12 years of Hebrew school, involved with the shul here starting when I was 19, so many Jewish friends, so many Jewish families. It wasn't until I got to Halifax that for the first time I had cholent. 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 Raise your hands if you know cholent. Because in Winnipeg, for the most part, this is a thing. Cholent is not a thing. We don't serve cholent at our Kiddush on Saturday. When I've gone to people's houses for holidays or for Shabbat, I have not been served cholent, and I've had many a Shabbat lunch. Cholentless. And yet, if you ask most people, and in Halifax it was everywhere, everyone had cholent. When we were making our lists at the beginning of this little exercise, what's Jewish foods? Name some Jewish foods. A lot of people, maybe you did, a lot of people would certainly be saying cholent. So it's this weird thing that it's not quite a Winnipeg thing. Cholent. So I was 23 years old and I experienced cholent in Halifax for the first time. So what is cholent for you Winnipeggers who may actually still not know or not be familiar with it? And maybe we could start a little cholent movement. Let's get cholent. Maybe we'll have a cholent. Maybe we'll get Joel LaFon, Chef Joel, to make a little cholent. We'll get some cholent going. Cholent is defined as a slow-simmered stew, usually with beans and meat, served for lunch on Shabbat. That's cholent. Slow-simmered stew, meat, beans. I guess stew means meat, right? Doi. Slow-simmered stew, beans, Shabbat lunch. Its origins are France, 1,000 years ago, the 11th century. They were making lunch stews in Spain, and then in that time, the Crusades, when things started kind of moving and people started moving in foods, and then the Christian world and the Islamic world, everything, they were seeing all these different foods, a lot from Spain. The Inquisition things, people being forced to move, people moving freely, trade from Spain to the south of France, to the south of Germany, and then to Eastern Europe. That's kind of how cholent spread its way. Now I didn't know there was Western Yiddish or Eastern Yiddish, but in doing my research I learned that in Western Yiddish, they call it shalet, S-C-H-A-L-E-T, shalet, chalice. In Eastern Yiddish, chont, and it seems to come from an old French word, chald, C-H-A-L-D, or C-H-A-L-T, which is the old French for warm. If you know your French, you know that now. How do you say warm? You'll say chaud, connected to that. So it comes from that because the key thing was that it was hot, right? Remember, another thing that affects Jewish cooking is that on Shabbat, you can't cook like you can on the other days. Right? Once Shabbat starts, there are some rules with, if you know some observant people, if you're observant with tin foil and how to keep the flame kind of going on a low flame so that it can kind of keep cooking, that you've started a fire from before Shabbat, right? It's a clever interpretation of a line in the Torah that says you may not kindle a fire on Shabbat, but if you get a fire going before Shabbat, you can keep it going, and you can allow it to keep something warm. So that was the key ingredient here, right? And especially into Eastern Europe, which has a climate similar to ours, what would be better on Shabbat lunch on a cold day than a warm stew? Hearty, with lots of beans, right? Makes a lot of sense. So that's where cholent comes from. Cholent. Oh, I like it. So people are talking about the cholent. Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah. But in Winnipeg, I'm telling you, Ramah Hebrew School, Joseph Alinsky Collegiate, Shared Zedek Synagogue. If my job was to learn about cholent when I went to Halifax at 23, they all failed me. I didn't know it. Wasn't a thing. No one in my family ever made cholent. And I know there's people out there who are nodding along. Don't be ashamed. We're bringing back the cholent. So that's where the cholent comes from, right? So the first mention of cholent that I was able to find was in the early 1200s. The whole idea with it was that it would kind of half cook it before Shabbat, and then you leave it on low heat overnight to cook by the time Shabbat lunch came around. So remember, home ovens is a relatively recent thing. A lot of Jewish food goes back to when there weren't home ovens. There would maybe be like a town bakery or a communal, like maybe a private oven, but the communal place was a town bakery. So what they would do was the mums would make their cholent, half cook it, whatever their secret ingredients were, and everybody's cholent would be different. And in fact, every cholent would be different. Even a person's cholent could vary from time to time. There's always a little bit of room. They would put it in this big pot. They would actually seal it. Where did I see? They would seal it with a flour paste. Really just got to seal in all the juices. The ladies would head down to the bakery on Friday late afternoon. All these ladies from around town were dropping off their cholents in this dish. They were all put inside the huge communal town bakery, like the oven. And then the dudes, on their way home from shul in the morning, early afternoon, they would pick up the pots and bring them home. And then I was reading it, they take off that flour paste and lift it up, and the aroma of cholent would waft into the air, and everyone would smell the cholent, right? The stew, the slow cooking, warm stew that they were going to eat. Beans, a meat, which is usually beef, a grain, which kind of was very common to be barley, onions. Those are your four main ingredients in cholent. What kind of beans? Do you actually want to throw in a few potatoes? Some people would say yes, some people would say no potatoes in my cholent. And the consistency can range. Some people's cholents are very soupy, others can be very, very thick, and everything in between. Probably the best thing about cholent that I read in my research for today was an author, maybe he was a poet, Heinrich Heine, who called cholent kosher ambrosia. So that's a little bit about cholent, a Jewish food. I just love this idea of all the ladies, this image, heading down with their cholents on Friday, dropping them off, and then all the guys coming back from shul and picking up their cholents on Saturday, late morning, early afternoon. Everyone having their cholent. Yeah. I like it. Yes, so some people are saying that Lent comes from slow. We talk about it being, very warm, very slow. So you're getting it. Awesome. Oh, my colleague Rena taught a little bit about cholent from her husband, Daniel's family, who's Moroccan. So yeah, I think that the consensus is we need to get some cholent here in Shared Zedek. I wonder if Joel has ever done he's ever done a cholent. Very cool. Very nice. Ah, cool. Very nice. Great stories on cholent. So that was another one I wanted to share with you, Jewish foods. From cholent, we get to kugel, because they're connected. How are we doing on time? Okay, we got to be out by 1 for sure. I can't go any longer than that. So kugel. How many of you just said right now into your computer with nobody around, it's Kegel? Right? One of these words like shul and shiel. That if you're a Galicianer, from southern Poland, everything became E. In my family, the joke around Pesach is that my great-grandfather, whom I knew, blessed memory, Sam Melamed Shoilik, maybe some of you knew him, he was legendary for visiting people in the hospital. He was that guy. He used to do Dayeni. Dayeni, right? Because of this Galicianer accent. Yes, so it can be Kugel or Kegel, and I'm gonna go on a limb here. I don't know if you know the story of where Kugel comes from. I found it fascinating, so I'm going to share it with you. Kugel goes back 8 centuries in Germany. So we're talking the 1200s. Okay? We know, of course, that it is, well, how would you describe kugel? Isn't this a tough one? A lot of my non-Jewish friends over the years from baseball, from living in Halifax, radio, what's a kugel, right? And especially the non-Jewish guests who would come to events on a Shabbat morning, because we may not have cholent here, but we have kugel. You know the Shared Zedek kugel with the cornflakes on top? That little twist? People love it. And you can, do you have it with your strawberries or your sour cream or what? My baba, that's more of a sweet kugel, right? And my baba usually made more of a parv kugel. No, she made a parv kugel and a dairy kugel. Well, wait, I'm going to get sidetracked. But anyway, how would you describe kugel? How would you define kugel? Like a baked pudding? There's noodles. It could be sweet. It could be savory. Is it a side dish? Is it dessert? Lots of questions. Let's get some answers. The basics of kugel. To be a kugel, you must have starch base, eggs, fat, and no water or other liquids. Very key. I told you there's a connection with kugel and cholent because kugel started, remember, 1200s, no home ovens. It was like a dumpling, like a bread batter with maybe a little bit of egg as a binding agent that was put inside the cholent pot to steam. While the cholent was in there cooking, this bread batter dumpling was in there too, and they served it alongside the cholent when they pulled it out. That's where kugel comes from. In fact, the name, what's a kugel? Kugeltopf. 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 I believe it's some Middle High German going on there. Topf. Kugel is a ball, right? They made the bread into a ball. Topf is a jar or a pot. Kugeltopf, the ball of bread in the cholent pot. That's where it comes from. And they started doing that back in the 1100s, right? In the 1100s. In the 1400s, Lokshen, noodles, had kind of made their way into Germany and into Eastern Europe. And the Lokshen, the noodles, replaced bread. In some places, you may hear of rice being used, or maybe cornmeal, or potatoes. Of course, that's a big one around Pesach time, is to use potatoes. Maybe matzah or matzah meal. Even some sweets. Then to mix in some sweets like dried fruit or cinnamon, carrots, cheese if you're doing a dairy one. So there's all kinds of different things that could be combined in. But the noodle was a transformative moment in the 1400s for kugel. And then the other thing was in the 1800s. By the mid-1800s, when home ovens were becoming a thing in Europe and then later obviously into America too, no longer was it something that you were baking inside the stew pot, but you were baking it outside in its own pot. And it became the baked pudding that we know today. So kugel as a baked pudding is like 150-ish years old. But kugel gets its origins from Kugeltopf, the ball of bread that was stewing inside the cholent. Bet you didn't know that. I sure didn't. Maybe you did. Kugeltopf. So there's lots of questions. Do you prefer the sweet or the savory? Do you, what do you put on your kugel? And of course, there's always little things, some people, I always liked a sweet kugel with a few raisins in it. And I love the way that Joel, our chef, does it here, where he's got the cornflakes on top. Very, very cool stuff. But that's where kugel comes from, Kugeltopf. Oh, one other thing about kugel. Kugel Yerushalmi, right? That's another interesting thing, is a lot of these Eastern European foods, some of them went to Israel and translated well, others didn't. Though Kugel Yerushalmi is a noodle, baked pudding noodle, that has both black pepper and caramelized sugar. It's kind of a sweet, savory thing going on, and it's very popular there. And one other story I'd never heard, this one's incredible. With all the different kinds of kugel out there, there is a Polish tradition on Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat right before Purim, where we're supposed to remember Amalek the great enemy of the Jewish people, of which Haman was an Amalek, that they would make 4 kugels for that Shabbat. They would make an apple, a mal, a flour kugel, a lokshin, a noodle kugel, and a kartoffel. Did I say that right? Potato kugel. Because the first letter of each of those spelled out Amalek. Never heard that one before. Pretty cool. Kugel. See how this is going. I prefer the savory. Willing to share the recipe is no one in Winnipeg. Okay, so Debbie is telling us on the chat, Debbie, that Winnipeg kugel is legendary, and she's been willing to share the recipe. No one in Toronto makes it like it shared. Wow. Very cool. Very cool. And Alina loves the shared zedekul too. Warm noodle pudding that tops bread pudding any day, hands down. It's Kegel, yeah. See, there we go. So that's a little bit about Kegel. Okay. You may have read a little piece. I wanted to toss a few holiday ones your way. I got so many stories here. I don't know if we'll get to all of them. We'll try our best. That I had an article came out in the Shofar about, this one's going to get a little racy, so just keep the kids, well, you're going to have to do a little explaining if you've got kids nearby. Just a warning here. It's just a build on another idea I found. If you read my article that came out in the Shofar, hopefully you did, it was supposed to be Purim timed, and then things got a little backed up, but it was still Purim, even though it was about a month after Purim. It was about Hamantashen. And I was always just so, I never bought this nonsense that these triangular-shaped cookies with, the prune or the apricot or the poppy seeds or whatever were supposed to be Haman's hat or Haman's ears. It was always nonsense. But you're a kid and it's Purim, everything's a little nonsensical, you don't question it. And so I kind of tried to trace a little bit of the history in Italy, like in a lot of these foods. Italy, there was so much trading going on and they had great climate and great produce and everything. Italy had a huge influence, and you probably read about it. Orecchi di Haman, calling it the ears of Haman. And that's why in Israel it's Oznei Haman. But in Germany and then later Eastern Europe, it's Hamantashen, which would literally be Haman's pockets. There's no mention whatsoever. But it probably was never supposed to be Hamantashen. It was Mon-Tashen. Mon is Yiddish for poppies. The original, they were poppy seed-filled pockets. Pockets of poppies, poppy pockets. Is that a thing? Polly pockets is a thing. These were poppy pockets. And then probably, my guess is, I wasn't there, someone heard Mon-Tashen. Oh, you mean Haman-Tashen? It's Purim. Haman. Oh, yeah. But what does this have to do with Haman? Oh, it probably looks like his ears. It doesn't really look like his ears. Yeah, but there are some stories that they would cut off his ears, and when they hanged him. And next thing you know, we're eating Oznei Haman and Hamantashen, and it's a whole confusing thing. Hopefully you read that. That was kind of the scattered Cole's Notes version of it. I've learned something since, or I learned something after the fact that just blew my mind to add to Hamantashen. Like, where did this all come from? By the way, just before I get to it, the Yiddish, which comes from the German Tasch, pocket, Taschen, also is where we get taxes from, the English word tax. Did you know that? Tasch, money in the pocket. True story. So the idea of, in medieval times, the idea of pastries, triangular-shaped pastries with jams or cheese or sweets or poppy seed, that was a very common thing. Originally, Hamantash were made with yeast dough, but over time, especially into the 20th century, cookie dough made it way, way easier. And the fillings, as we know, evolved too. In fact, the story that I learned, that was crazy, where prunes for Hamantashen came from, Bohemia. So what's that, like southern Germany, Czech Republic kind of area, right? Bohemia. There was this guy, 1731, named Brandeis, who was thrown in jail for something that he didn't do, and when he was, for selling bad prunes. That's what it was, for selling poisonous prunes. And when he was cleared of his charges and released, it was right before, like a couple days before Purim, so the whole town, this whole town, had a fest where they used prunes and everything, and that's where prunes became a thing for Hamantashen. You can look that one up. But this is the crazy thing that I learned. So we know that throughout history, from reading the prophets especially, that our ancient Jewish ancestors, the Israelites, had troubles staying faithful to just one God, right? They would, golden calf, we read about that not too long ago, and they would have, there's worship like Baal Peor, other gods, right? And they were in places like Babylonia, right, when they were in exile, where there were tons of other gods. And in fact, Purim is a special story in the canon of Jewish stories because it's the only story, really, the only major holiday story that happens outside of Israel, right? It's the diaspora story. It's in Persia, after the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, and it's in Persia. And there's this strong theory that Mordechai and Esther are homages to Babylonian gods Marduk and Ishtar. Things are getting to turn, right? So Esther, who's the heroine, is a nod to Ishtar, and Ishtar was, among other things, a goddess of fertility. Now, if you do a little more digging, you'll find that many, many cultures where, like in colder places like Germany, Eastern Europe, Canada, where you come out of the desolate winter and into the spring, that there would be lots of rituals to try and appease the gods so that now food will grow again. And then in a lot of places, one of the ways they would do this is they would bake cakes or pastries in the shapes of these fertility gods and goddesses. Groundhog Day, actually, Candlemas, has a connection to this too, if you want to do a little more reading on your own. But this is why, and I couldn't believe it, I'm building up to it, I hope the payoff is worth it. What does a vagina look, I just blew it. What does a hamantaschen look like? Well, I told you. I can't believe I just did that. That was the Freudian of all slips. It looks like a vagina. And when you know that they are originally poppy seeds inside a vagina-shaped cookie, I'm going to not try and say vagina again. It was a fertility cookie to the goddess Ishtar, probably, where it started. Haman's ears. Nonsense. What does a vagina look like? It looks like a hamantaschen. Like a hamantaschen. Whoops! Okay, I want to give you a couple of more. Latkes. One of the ultimate holiday foods. Latkes. Do you do yours in a food processor? Do you grade your potatoes? My wife is watching. That's why my phone blew up. Yeah, that was a slip. That was a Freudian slip. Latkes are fascinating. I told this story once. Hanukkah, oil, latkes, I think we just, latkes, that's maybe a Jewish food you throw out there, reminds you of the holidays. You want your latkes to be the same, Baba's latkes, the recipe. But latkes are, relatively modern. I don't think we really think about that. I found the latkes story fascinating. Pancakes and breads predate pans and ovens. You like throw a little bit of gruel, cook it up. When pottery became a thing, terracotta griddles, later metal, but pancakes and bread and pancakes has been a thing for hundreds and hundreds of years. After the First Crusade, when things were being shared, we talked about before, in Italy, they started doing eggs and maybe wine or milk instead of just bread, which was kind of a cool idea. And that's sort of more of like what a pancake that we think of, a modern pancake. The first time you see the word pancake, 1430 in England. But how did pancakes and latkes, which mean little oily, by the way, did you know that? Livivot is the Hebrew word, probably connected to lev. I don't know, do they look like hearts? I'm not sure. But latke, Yiddish, that's little oily. And we know this as usually predominantly potato pancakes. So over time, there became this two kinds of foods on Hanukkah. We know about fried foods, the oil, the miracle of the oil, foods fried in oil, for sure. But for a long time, there was a strong custom of having dairy on Hanukkah. It has to do with a story that got connected to Hanukkah, kind of conflated. It wasn't actually a Hanukkah story involving, what was her name? She killed Holofernes. Judith? I think her name is Judith. The couple of references to my little hamantaschen thing are pretty funny. she basically, Judith, she kills this horrible Assyrian general by luring him, seducing him into her tent and getting him drunk and making him pass out on wine and salty cheeses. And it wasn't a Hanukkah story, but it somehow became a Hanukkah story. So then there was this custom of having dairy and fried oil. Why do I tell you this? Because there's references to pancakes on Hanukkah go back to a Rabbi, Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, in the early 1300s. And Sicilian Jews were making ricotta pancakes. So I often ask the kids when I tell them stories, what were the first latkes? They were cheese. They were cheese fried in olive oil. The Ukrainian word, oladka, comes from Greek, eladia, oilies, or eleon, olive oil. Eleon is also where the English word oil comes from. But oladka is Ukrainian for oilies, and that's where latka came from. So first they started off as soft cheese fried in oil or butter, and they would serve them with sour cream. This was in Southern Europe or Central Europe. By the time that this custom made its way up to Northern Europe, where it was winter and cold, cheese and butter they couldn't get because it was a luxury in the winter. Oil was always scarce, so they would have to use schmaltz, goose fat, to cook. But you can't cook. This is where kashrut plays a role. You can't cook cheese in schmaltz. So they went to rye, or more popularly, buckwheat. And then the real game changer was potatoes. Remember, potatoes came from South America. And I didn't know this, but at first they were very, very skeptical of potatoes. They thought they might be poison in Europe. They thought they might be poisonous. People only got into potatoes when famines forced them to. In 1839 and 1840, in Eastern Europe, there was a terrible famine. And then they discovered that potatoes, were resilient. They could grow them anywhere. It was very, very successful. They could live off these potatoes. And so things really exploded about 150 years ago in Eastern Europe. Before that, even in places where they were starting to eat potatoes, it was a common folk sort of thing. So some people looked down on those who ate potatoes. And then by the end of the 1800s, of course, latkes had made it over to America, and vegetable oil was a thing, Crisco was a thing, and so sour cream could come back. But potato pancakes, what a story, potato latkes. Okay, my wife. Not sure my wife will ever eat hum and taschen after that. Well, at least people have been watching. It's a fun moment. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. This went faster. There's so many stories. We'll have to do more of this. Maybe I rambled too much. I apologize. But just like brisket, right? You couldn't afford to eat high on the cow, to live on the higher cuts. So brisket comes from a lower cut. And brisket's really a testament to creativity and talent of Jewish cooks to take something that was originally kind of a not-so-prized cut and turn it into something totally flavorful, juicy, and tender. Whole briskets are huge. Brisket is the part covering the cow's breastbone between below the short ribs. And in some places, one of the things with brisket was in the winter, as they were getting close to Hanukkah, guys who raised cows, it was expensive to keep cows through the winter, so there was always a surplus of beef in winter around Hanukkah, and that's where brisket started kind of getting really popular. Slow simmered in liquid, throw in your onions. In Yiddish, it was known as gedämpfte Brustfleisch, boiled breast meat. Then after the 1800s, potatoes, you throw those in. Carrots were a big thing. And in America, as Jewish people in many places started becoming more successful, they were able to eat brisket more often and not just on holidays. And of course, brisket, when you soak it in brine and cook it slowly, becomes corned beef. And then there's a whole conversation about pastrami, another one of those Jewish foods. The story of where pastrami, the name comes from, is fascinating. The Ottomans, like the Ottoman Empire, they were kind of the ones, the pioneers of drying slices of meat for preservation. They called it bastarma, which is from the Turkish for press, bastarma. When the Ottomans conquered the Balkans, and then the word of what they were doing got to Romania, a lot of in Romania, I don't know Romanian. Hi, Romania, Romania. I don't know a lot of Romanian, but apparently bees sound like peas, so they started calling it pastarma. And that became pastrami. But what we think of pastrami really took off in New York. It's kind of an American thing. It's meat from a brisket. Part of the brisket called the beef plate. You got it in the wine vinegar and the spices. You put in brine, and then you mix it with wine vinegar and spices, which you don't do with corned beef, so that's how it's different. Dry cured for a couple of weeks, smoke it for 6 to 7 hours, steam it or braise it. And a guy named Sussman Volk, who came to America in 1887 from Lithuania, made a deal. You should look him up. He made a deal where in exchange, he was able to get this prized recipe for brisket, and he's kind of one of the pioneers of brisket. But so many good things. I mean, we could talk about bagels, ring-shaped circle of life cycle event. The hole was a practical thing, right? Because they're boiled in water and they're really hot. How do you get them out? The hole was a practical thing. Talk about knishes, rugelach, blintzes. Maybe we'll do another one of these simas. But the last one I wanted to tell you, just before we finish up here, is, and thank you for bearing with me. And I hope you had a little bit of fun, and hope you're not too hungry. I'm starving, so I'm going to go get something to eat. Some of my Chef Joel leftovers. The maror question. I've always said it should be horseradish. I've always wanted the horseradish. And this year we found a batch of horseradish that was just absolutely outstanding. I'm going to grab my iPad because I want to read you this story. Hang on. So, maror. What's really interesting about maror is that, we know all about maror, the bitter herbs, to remind us of the bitterness of life of our ancestors as slaves. But in the Hebrew, in the Torah, the word is mirorim, which is a plural. And the interpretation is that there isn't one specific, because plural is used, I find this very interesting, because it's mirorim, because it's a plural, there isn't one specific vegetable or thing that is maror. There are a bunch of different kinds that are maror. And in the Talmud, the Mishnah, there are 5 items that, having met proper qualifications, could be used. The qualifications are oh shoot. The plants have to push upwards from the ground in time for Passover. They have to sport relatively mild flavored leaves, which when mature form a hard central stalk as the leaves become tough and more bitter. There are 5 items that can be used, the Mishnah says, for maror. Chazeret, ulshin, tamcha, charchavina, and maror, specifically. And that chazeret was the preferable vegetable. A lettuce, but not like iceberg lettuce, right? But what is really interesting, where the whole horseradish thing, one of those types is tamcha. Seems to be a leafy, dull green herb. The leading candidate for tamcha, according to Rashi, is called horehound. Horehound. I'd never heard of it, horehound. Also called white horehound, and in Arabic, hashishat al-kalib. It's a plant whose primary usage today is in cough medicine and liqueurs. Horehound has crinkled, woolly, grayish-green leaves and contains a latex sap. The leaves are indeed bitter. But because horehound sounds sort of close to horseradish, that is why a lot of Ashkenazim started eating horseradish as their maror. Unfortunately, horseradish lacks all of the characteristics prescribed by the Talmud. Can you believe it? I've been living a lie. My mom was right. She so often is. I guess we have to go back to romaine lettuce. Sorry to end on such a downer, but horseradish shouldn't be your maror. Hope you had a lot of fun. I wasn't expecting to go this long. Hope you enjoyed. Hope there are still a few left. The chat has slowed down, so maybe my Hamantash and story drove everybody away. I sure had fun researching some of these stories, putting it together, and there's lots more, of course. I guess the last thing we could maybe say about Jewish food is that the stories behind the food are important, but often are never told, like where these names come from. I once heard a great description that Jewish food, for Ashkenazim especially, is a lot like the Yiddish language. It's a German base that has been influenced by other languages and other cultures. And it reminds us of where our people have come from to get to where they are now. Jewish foods are passed down. I know that in my own family, my wife is learning and trying new recipes, my sister trying new recipes, so that our Baba's recipes will continue to live on decades into the future. And I think that that's one of the most important things about Jewish foods, is this link to the past. In Judaism, the links to the past, and that's what Passover, Pesach, is all about, but really what Judaism is all about. And the foods, for so many people, are the way that they get into Judaism. God can be a difficult thing, synagogue can be a difficult thing, they don't understand, but there's something that they know. They know matzo ball soup, and they know gefilte fish, and they know kugel or kegel, and they know charoset and maror. And the stories behind the foods kind of fill in the blanks that I think really help ensure Jewish continuity and Jewish identity. So I want to leave you with that, some Jewish food for thought. Hope you enjoyed. Chag Pesach Sameach. Tomorrow at 12, you'll have Rabbi Anibal Mas and his BYOL, Bring Your Own Lunch and Learn. I'm Rabbi Matthew. It's been a pleasure. Thanks you, everybody. Thank you for being on the chats. And sorry about the Hamantashen. I'm going to hear about that later. All right. Bye, folks. Take care. Go get